Hello, everyone. In this introductory lecture, we're going to go over some background material pertaining to literary genres. This lecture is going to establish some basic concepts that will carry through the rest of the course and that will undergird our discussion of the literary genre of the weird tale. First, one thing to know is that a literary genre is not set in stone. It's not some necessarily objective classification of literature. When we think of a genre, we can think of, let's say, science fiction or fantasy. And we have in the back of our minds certain conventional tropes and expectations for that particular genre. Swords and sorcery, spaceships, and laser guns. But the terms that we use to classify a genre, the expectations that we have, and the criteria that we use to delineate one genre from another are not set in stone. They're not handed down from on high. The definitions of genres and even the natures of genres change and evolve over time. They're classified differently by different theorists. So one critic might say that a particular set of incidences or tropes, conventions, defines the genre of tragedy in one way. And another person might come along and say, actually, you're wrong. There are all these other factors that we have to take into consideration, and these are actually the things that are necessary for a tragedy to be considered a tragedy, or for a tragedy to be a good tragedy. So one of the underlying questions and a series of assumptions that goes into a literary genres course is this notion of genre. And it's something that we're going to interrogate for just a moment. And I'm going to do that or illustrate this point that I've tried to make about genres by way of reference to functionally the initial definition of tragedy by Aristotle. Now, Aristotle, both a philosopher and what we would kind of consider a literary critic, although nothing of the sort existed in his era, categorized various different genres, from epic poems to tragedies to histories and the like. Aristotle, living in his day, was descriptive in the same way that he adopted a kind of empiricist or quasi-empiricist approach to the understanding of the universe and his philosophical system. So too, he adopted an empirical perspective or approach to the categorization of literary genres. In other words, he looked at evidence around him, he looked at the world around him, he gathered evidence, and he compiled that evidence into a description. So he didn't theorize and say, this is what a literary genre is like, this is what the literary genre of tragedy is like. He said, no, I'm going to look at as many tragedies as I can, I'm going to extract the common elements. So he went around, he watched as many works of tragedy as he could, and then said, here are the commonalities between them. Here are the approaches that authors adopt. So as a consequence, the definition of tragedy that he offered, the definition of the genre that he offered, was descriptive rather than proscriptive. He's saying this is what people do when they're writing tragedies, not what people have to do when they're writing tragedies. Now, what should become immediately apparent is that this is a kind of biased way of developing a genre. He's looking at examples of the genre that exist. And then he says, based on what I see, this is what a tragedy is supposed to look like. However, each of these tragedies is a product of his own culture. The kinds of works or the kinds of values that we see embedded in those works from one time period to another change radically. So for instance, based on the cultural presumptions and values of his era, when he looked at tragedy, he said that the most fit subject for a tragedy would be a man, because a man can demonstrate the kind of virtues that are necessary for a hero that a woman simply can't, because she isn't possessed of those capabilities. Now, obviously, we disagree with that, but that's a reflection of the culturally instantiated values that he saw in the plays and that he believed himself, or he held himself, because he was a product of his culture. So genre, and the genre of tragedy in this case, is a result of the particular historical cultural moment in which the theorist who is compiling this genre, trying to define this genre, lived. He also said, for instance, that characters had to act according to their class. So a kind of nobility and honor would be expected from a man of high breeding or a man of great public respect and high repute. But such would not be expected and would not be fitting for a low-born commoner in a work of fiction. So the values and presumptions of his culture are read into and then form part of the basis for his genre, or his definition of the genre of tragedy. Other factors beyond cultural ones have an influence on the definition of genres. As an example, we can look at those two genres that I mentioned earlier on this video, fantasy and science fiction. Genres such as fantasy, horror, and science fiction initially didn't exist as separate categories. These genres were invented, in essence. People began to look at different stories and identify commonalities between them. Originally, all these kinds of works were grouped under a much larger categorization of, well, speculative fiction, largely. Even that was a kind of invented term that emerged. However, all these genres kind of coalesced into one thing. People, however, saw that there were these commonalities or subgroupings that could possibly be made. And one of the reasons for that was a series of economic factors. As you have the rise of popular magazines and the ability to sell stories, to sell books to people, it behooves you to identify these delineations because you can identify a target market. And that's really how these separate genres of fantasy, horror, and science fiction emerged in a very broad brush and generalized way. Obviously, things are a great deal more complex. We could get into the nitty-gritty of how these genres evolved and how people categorize them and the like. But if we're looking at this from broad strokes, just to get this general idea, market forces played a tremendous part in the categorization of these different genres, or the delineation, the teasing out of these genres from one much larger whole. Put yourself in the shoes of a bookseller. You have a bookstore, or you have a magazine store, and you're trying to sell to an audience. It behooves you to be able to place all the kinds of books that are the same in one area. It behooves you to have genres, because if somebody comes in looking for Lord of the Rings, for instance, maybe as they're perusing the shelves, because you have all the books like the Lord of the Rings sitting in the same place, they're going to happen on A Song of Ice and Fire. And suddenly you've sold two books for the price of one, or you've sold two books to the same customer who only came in looking for one. So the division and categorization of genres has a kind of economic background because, well, it's economically viable and reasonable to separate out these genres so that you can more easily identify and sell to a particular target market. So with these ideas in mind, with this understanding that genres are not monolithic, they are kind of created in this process of negotiation and development, we can move on to the definition of the weird tale. This is a complex one, and it's something that we'll tease out and break down and discuss throughout the entire course. But this is the basic definition that is offered to us by the man who defined the weird tale in the first place, H.P. Lovecraft, one of the central figures that we're going to be studying in this course. H.P. Lovecraft said this, that the true weird tale, the genre of the weird tale, has a certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. Now, that's a mouthful, and it's complex, but the basic idea is that the weird tale creates an atmosphere of dread, but it's not a specific human kind of dread. It's a dread of outer unknown forces, a dread of things that are beyond human comprehension, beyond our understanding, something alien, something weird, something unnatural. And there must be a hint expressed with the seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos. So he's saying here, and again, this is an expression of his own beliefs and his cultural values. He's saying human beings as a species try to make sense, try to organize and order the universe. We try to impose order onto chaos by constructing or inventing laws of the universe. So think about the laws of physics or the interaction between elementary particles, stoichiometry, or the various different laws governing the fundamental forces. These are the laws of nature, the laws perhaps that we impose on nature to make sense out of something that is fundamentally just roiling chaos. In the weird tale, we get the sense that these laws are just that. They're just fictions. These laws seem to be overturned, these laws seem to be violated, and it creates a sense of dread that there's something in this universe that we truly don't understand, that's beyond any of our attempts to categorize it and to control it through the imposition of laws. And in turn, the weird tale inspires this sense of dread. It's something beyond human. Now, if you want a summary of that definition or that basic overview of Lovecraft's definition, you can take a look at this final slide. As we move on in the course, we're going to be taking a look at H.P. Lovecraft's definition of the genre and the work in which he established this definition in order to better understand the kind of cultural presumptions and values that undergird it. I've alluded to some of them, but we'll look at them in more detail and parse out those kinds of assumptions.